Okay, hello everyone. See the breakout rooms closing. Welcome. I know. No matter how you do it, it's like almost never a graceful exit from the breakout rooms. It's really hard to time a conversation to end gracefully that precisely to the second. But thank you to the students who facilitated those conversations. Thank you to those who joined them. And I'm eager to see how they feed into our longer, large group conversations. So welcome. I'm Amy Starczewski. I direct the Oral History Master's Program here at Columbia. And this event is part of our regular Thursday evening public programming series, which we do in different formats. And this semester we're experimenting with a book club, which is new for us. And I chose this format for a couple of reasons, just to give you a little context for why we're here today. One is that book clubs are about reading, of course, but they're also, as we all know, in large part about being social. And we really wanted to create spaces where people connect and build knowledge together, just like they do in an oral history encounter. And so we felt like this format kind of mirrors some of the things that we really love about oral history. And also book clubs are for pleasure, and we really want our events to feel like treats, not chores. So hopefully that's what we'll find this evening. I know I'm really looking forward to it. So in this book club, obviously, we're reading oral history novels. I'm pretty sure I made that genre up, and it's a bit capacious. So it includes novels that are about doing oral history, like Lost Children Archive, the book that we talked about last month, books that are in the form of oral history, like the book we're talking about today, and then also books like Liberty that we'll talk about 4 weeks from now, that use oral history as source material. And so each of our book club events will feature one or more oral historians in conversation with in this case, 2 authors. So I'm going to introduce our oral historians, and then they'll take it from here. We have 3 OHMA alums who all practice speculative oral history in various ways. And I'll read a little bio for each of them. So Kae Bara Kratcha is a librarian at Columbia University Libraries. Kae's work as an oral historian centers on queer and trans experience, speculative oral history, and queer networks, organizing and mutual aid in their neighborhood of Astoria, Queens. And once I'm done with these introductions, I'll put links in the chat to check out Kae's work, speculative oral history project called Body Homemaker, which I highly recommend. Tamara Santibañez is an interdisciplinary artist and oral historian living and working in Brooklyn. As a queer and trans artist, their practice memorializes the language and resistance strategies used by othered populations to build alternative worlds, focusing most recently on investigating the intersection of tattooing and the prison system. They're the author of Could This Be Magic? Tattooing as Liberation Work. And I'm going to share link to their work in the chat also. And then finally, Taylor Thompson is a doctoral student in American Studies and African American Studies at Yale. She works to develop research at the intersection of economic history and Black feminist theory. And her OHMA thesis unfolded, which I love that verb for what a thesis does, into a public online oral history and speculative archive. The project developed Black feminist listing practices for engaging with oral histories of mutual aid organizers as they spoke about the types of economies and futures they're working to produce through their organizing. So I think you all can see how I read this book and thought of these people and thought how amazing it would be if we could have a big conversation for oral historians to chat about everything that's so provocative in this text. So with that, I'll turn it over to our facilitators and welcome them and our guests.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Amy. I'm Tamara, they, them, and I'm just going to start us off with a quick land acknowledgement before we get into the event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the ancestral and unceded territory which we are currently occupying. For Columbia University and those of us in New York City, it is that of the Lenape people whose history and continued relationship to the land we honor by committing ourselves to anti-colonial and land sovereignty struggles. Beyond mere acknowledgement, we encourage connection and solidarity with Indigenous rights movements, especially as we enter into this discussion around revolutionary futures. For one tool that you can use to begin to learn about the native land that you're on, you can visit Native Land website, which I'll put in the chat for everyone. And I just want to say thank you everyone for coming. I'm so excited to be here with everyone, all of you.
Thanks, Tamara. Hi, everybody. My name's Kae. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm gonna read some bios for our authors. And thank you to Taylor for taking a little extra time to do a bit of additional research into our author's work. Okay, so Emmy OBrien writes on gender, freedom, capitalism, and communist theory towards trans-communist futures. Emmy is also a psychotherapist and educator. Emmy is the co-editor of a number of magazines, including Pinko on gay communism and Parapraxis on psychoanalytic theory and politics. Her work on family abolition has been translated into Chinese, German, Greek, French, Spanish, and Turkish. Family abolition is, of course, a major theme in Everything for Everyone. And so to learn more about Emmy's scholarship on family abolition, we encourage everyone to check out her forthcoming book, Family Abolition, Capitalism, and the Communizing of Care, which is being released in June of this year from Pluto Press. Emmy previously coordinated the New York City Trans Oral History Project and worked in HIV and AIDS activism and services. She completed her PhD in sociology at NYU, and she wrote about how capitalism shaped New York City LGBTQ social movements. And Eman Abdelhadi writes on gender, religion, migration, and Muslims in the US. She is an academic, an activist, and an artist, and she is an assistant professor of comparative human development and sociology at the University of Chicago. She's been involved in the movement for Palestinian liberation, Black Lives Matter, counter-surveillance, and abolitionism, Marxist feminist mobilization, as well as workplace struggles. She is currently co-coordinating the Muslim Alliance for Gender and Sexual Diversity, a national organization that provides support and builds community by and for queer Muslims. Abdelhadi maintains an active creative practice that includes performance art and essay and poetry writing. Her writing has appeared in Jacobin, Mufta, and other publications. Her current book-length manuscript is called Impossible Futures: Why Women Leave Muslim Communities While Men Stay. And while the book may not yet be available, she recently delivered a really compelling lecture on the book project that you can find on YouTube under the same name if you'd like to learn more.
That was wonderful. I'm so excited to be here and to have the opportunity to engage with everyone, especially with the opportunity to have the authors in the room. What a gift. Thank you so much for coming. Before we kind of start asking questions and engaging, I just kind of wanted to share a bit of a synopsis of how I engaged with the work, just to have some kind of like offering to the space and to you all for your really generous scholarship. Everything for Everyone is, as the title suggests, an oral history of the New York Commune 2052 to 2072, which is to say that this work is a speculative oral history and archival project that I think challenges imaginations, hegemonic imaginations pertaining to the future of New York. In the speculative history, a series of wars and crises and revolutions have taken place, leading to a world, or at least a city, where capital, carcerality, the nuclear family, the 8-hour workday, hunger, and debt in both its monetary and ideological forms have just been abolished. But this future is not a utopia, right? Instead, it's grounded in really realistic externalities of revolution following imperialism and colonization and war and racial capitalism, amongst many other evils. the narrators sharing their recollections of revolutions they experienced and of their lives in the 50s and 70s explain a future that is not without trauma or violence. It is not without hard and really critical interpersonal negotiations or struggles in the name of love. But I think that it is a world where love is a social and political praxis that is not only encouraged, but is allowed to flourish by the support of social and physical infrastructure and geography, something that reminds me of Catherine McKintrick's ideas of geography being alterable, geography and being human being alterable. So I'm really honored to have a chance to be in conversation with you, the authors, today, and to facilitate community engagement with a text that, to me, at its core, is about building really deliberate community spaces in which care and the communizing of knowledge can be practiced with great rigor. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm so excited to have this discussion. We've got kind of an opening question to kind of kick us off, and we'll proceed with a couple of facilitated questions for a bit. But folks, as you're listening, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Alternatively, at the end, we will also just have some free space for folks to speak up and ask your questions. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Taylor. All right, so I've got our opening question. So I kind of started to think about this book among many other things, but one of the ways I started to think about it was as a way to train people, to train readers who maybe aren't so familiar with oral history as a practice, as a field, on how to read oral history kind of as a genre of literature. So with that in mind, I was really interested in the writing and inclusion of your fictional interviews that kind of like don't go well, which I mean, by that I mean like interviews where the narrator is resistant to talking, even though, you know, they signed up to be a narrator, or they're not answering in a way that the interviewer can follow. And that might be kind of hard for the reader to parse, which I think is pretty instructional on like what might happen in an oral history interview and like what is still worth including, even if that happens. And that's kind of an impulse I have in my own work, to try to teach audiences what oral history is, while also kind of trying to convey a story or a theme. But I find that sometimes that means making the story more difficult to immediately access for audiences, because it like means that you're breaking narrative conventions. So I guess my question is, does that sort of ring true to you? And why did you decide to write in moments of difficult interviewing when you could have chosen not to?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Emmy OBrien. Thank you for just those magnificent introductions and the synopsis, and I echo Eman's comments in the chat. And we usually both respond to questions and trade off a little bit who goes first, but I'll speak to this a little bit. Definitely coming to this project was motivated a lot by my years working in oral history, coordinating the New York City Trans Oral History Project, and getting the opportunity to coordinate with a lot of people who are here, and becoming really fascinated with oral history as a form, as a way of thinking, as a way of listening, as a way of being, and recognizing just the transformative power of learning how to listen well and how incredible that is. And it was a major motivator in my experience with oral history and transitioning into psychoanalytic training and working as a therapist and other things that I do now. And we wanted to convey a little bit of that in the book. I mean, whereas we're making up the voices, so it's not quite a kind of encounter with the other that makes oral history so extraordinary, but the sense of surprise, the dynamism, and the way that oral history operates on so many levels simultaneously, right? There's like the dynamic in the room There's what's happening in the patient's emotional and psychological internal conflicts that is expressed in their speech. And then there's the story that they're telling. And then also the story that has been torqued and inflected through the vagaries of memory and relationships. And like all of these things are happening simultaneously. And I think in writing the book, Eman and I really found, I certainly found, that it was a very powerful form for sort of exploring all these things at once. And trauma is kind of one of the axes of that the world of racial capitalism and the struggle to overthrow it involved a lot of harm, a lot of tremendous trauma that people suffered. And so many, many characters reflect on that trauma in a variety of ways. And many people have done a lot of healing work and a lot of like trying to work through the harm that they've dealt with. But the interviews that you drew attention to are the two interviews where most obviously the person has not worked through it. They might have tried, but it weighs very heavily on them in the room. And the Connor Stevens interview, I kind of modeled after sort of a study of trauma flashbacks. Like he is in a flashback in a hardcore way. And so, the interview, so the way the conversation happens really fragments and distorts his ability to tell a story at all. And that is as important a way of understanding how his mind works, the horrors of war. In this case, he was one of the few people in the book who was like an armed combatant in a civil war. And you learn as much about, I hope, about like his experience as you do from other characters who are able to explain their experience in great detail. Is there more, Eman, that you can add to this question?
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you all for having us here and for this wonderful chance. I think, Emmy, you covered most of what I'd want to say about this. I would just only add that I think in some ways the past is unknowable, and oral history is particularly beautiful as a form because it highlights the sort of the necessary patchiness of trying to understand what's happened in the world, right? Or to understand a history, any history. And so, yeah, so I think that those interviews help highlight that, right? And the fact of the necessarily partial form that any knowledge about the past takes.
Thank you. I would love to keep talking on this subject, but I think we're going to move on to our next question, which is Tamara's.
That was so lovely, and I think actually a great segue into the next question, because of how you touched on trauma and memory and the ways of working through those things, because something that stayed with me personally for a long time after finishing the book is how emotionally affecting the reading process was at times. And I found myself in reading it having to, read it in sections, taking some time to sit with what was coming up for me personally in response to the distance and the closeness of the revolution that you were describing. Because you write about a very near future relatively, which naturally is making us consider our current reality and its relationship to that. And so I'm curious how you found the experience and I guess the intention of balancing the realistic incitements and aspects of revolution like death and violence and climate catastrophe and the emotions of grief and struggle while ultimately producing a book that I think is about hope. So what was that process like for you both?
Thank you for that question. That's such a beautiful question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the book is in some ways straddles this line between utopia and dystopia, right? In the sense that you have to sort of get through the really difficult parts, right, before you get to the hopeful endpoint or beginning of a new phase. But I think that for me, when I read a lot of speculative fiction, there's either a sort of utopic future that is totally inaccessible, right? Because it's so far into the future that we can't imagine it, or it's an entirely different world. It's literally a different planet, right? Something that's unimaginable in terms of our own reality, or it's an extremely dystopic version of what we're living through, or a sort of an intensification of the world that we're living in, such that we reach our end, right, as a species and as a civilization. And I think what we wanted to do in this book is to have neither of these things, to have a sort of plausible a future that's hopeful because it's plausible, but because it's plausible, it has to deal with the realities of the kind of the destructive nature of our world, right? And so it was, so I think we were trying to kind of live in the middle between these things, and that fundamentally necessitates that grief and that sadness and that fear that you're describing as a reader, because I think that we can't hinge our hope on the idea that we exit this world entirely, right? Or that capitalism as it exists now, or the state as it exists now, just magically disappears, or has one clear solution that doesn't involve, intense amounts of more trauma, right? We can't hinge our hope on that and continue to have hope, right? And so the hope has to be tied to something somewhat plausible. And so I think that in a way, we're trying to sort of mirror that process of hanging on to the good in all of us, our ability to resist, our ability to create beauty out of destruction, right? And have that be what triumphs in the end. I think that's what makes this a hopeful novel, is that a different group of people triumph, but we're not doing something fundamentally different than what we do when we, occupy a square for a month, or when we, go on strike as workers, or when we, create mutual aid after a storm, right? We're doing the same things in this book. We're just doing them under different conditions.
I'll just add something that Eman told me as we were writing it, which was how intense and overwhelming it was writing the chapter on Palestine, like you described, writing through periods and crying and needing to stop and come back to it. And that was very affecting at the time. Like I think the space that I get into when writing, much more than reading, can be very, very sort of cut off emotionally. Like I'm like trying to figure out how to make up emotions and make them seem real, like in a way that's really kind of disconnected. And it reminded me that there are very different ways of holding the space. And I think as we were writing it, that began to open up for me, like feeling an affective bond with these fictional people in a way that I do for the people that they might vaguely resemble that I know in the world or whatnot, but I like letting them into my heart a little.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. And the next question is Taylor's.
I'll just add that I know we have a shortage of time, but you all as discussants have a lot of very interesting things to say. Like in our pre-conversation, it was very clear. And your questions are well formulated to sort of present that or put that out there. And that's great. But like, I do encourage you guys to respond to what we say for, to open it up to a conversation to some extent as it flows. So yeah, but up to you. You're your events, so we'll roll with whatever happens.
Thank you for that. I think we're all being shy because we don't want to cut into the Q&A when everyone will get to chime in. But I think our questions are also going to get broader and more abstract as we go. So hopefully that will also generate some more voices.
Yeah, thank you for that invitation. I can definitely hop in with one of those broad questions, and also for the rest of the participants, if you have thoughts or questions as we have these discussions, please put them in the chat. It's definitely something we'll engage with as well. But as you were talking about just letting one another into your hearts as you were engaging in the writing practice, you know, I'm curious about that kind of what I might want to call like a loving practice, and even what it might mean to use the word love in the context of scholarship. On page 7, let's ground it in the text. The text is so good. On page 7, in the introduction, you guys write, the experience of successful collective action, however violent and chaotic, enabled participants to imagine and create new forms of love and solidarity, of being together with each other and ultimately healing. And I'm definitely struggling as a scholar to engage with the word love in the way that I think that, you know, Black feminist texts lead me to do, but with the fear that it will be kind of understood as silly or a strange word to try to bring to the fore. And I'm super curious about, yeah, just the practice of love in one's scholarship and having the bravery to use the word at all. Like I'm almost afraid to use it sometimes. So I would love your insight. Yeah.
In my research about family abolition right now, in the book that I just finished and it's off to the printers, I guess some people got galleys this week. I haven't yet. I'm really excited to see them. I close with talking about Martin Luther King's beloved community and put that alongside Mark's talking about Gemma Bison, a sort of idea of community on the kind of other side of insurrection. And really trying to think about, like, what would a world be where we were able to care for each other? Like, I think a lot of people love each other very, very much. And that we live in conditions where that our opportunities for like genuinely expressing that are quite limited. They're limited to like nuclear families, a few close friendships, you know, a few parenting relationships here or there, some romances, right? But it's all very closed off. And that the moments for like actually encountering each other with love in a more open way are much, much harder to find. And for me, and yet we're all interdependent with each other, right? Capitalist production spans the globe and we're all dependent. For like every article of our clothing depends on 100 other workers working very hard that we are connected to, right? Like the world is just this dense web of interdependency that strangely, in the dynamics of capitalism, is completely anonymous, right? It's like you have no idea who these people are. You have no ability to relate to anyone because the only relationship there is the exchange of commodities, right? And so this kind of impersonal domination that actually reigns over our relationships with each other. And we just have to like carve out these very awkward, very precarious spaces to like have close bonds with anyone. And that the only moments that this really starts to break down is in talking about solidarity, and particularly talking about solidarity in a context of insurrection, where like the boundaries between institutions, people, hold on, sorry, I have to go. One moment, I'll let a man speak.
Ooh. That was a quick passing of the mic. I hope everything's okay. So Emmy was talking about moments of solidarity. Hi.
Hi, I'm in my professional therapy office and someone just walked in. I couldn't figure out what was going on.
Great.
It hasn't happened before, my apologies.
I hadn't really started a real sentence. Since you left.
Yeah, I'll just say it's incredible, the experience of being able to care about people that you're in struggle with. And that's both like people you're fighting alongside, and it's people that you're fighting for, like halfway around the world, and who, like when you read the news, turn out to be fighting for you too, right? And that's so, it's it's such a miraculous thing. And it's this glimpse of what could be on the other side of not organizing our entire world around the exchange of commodities as the dominant driving force of human society. That's all. Did you have more to say, Eman?
No, I think I'll leave it there and answer the next one. But I do think the love question is a tough one, and I think about this in my scholarship a lot as well. I mean, I think it's easier to convey in fiction than it is in scholarship, unfortunately, where such fuzzy feminine concepts are often dismissed. But yeah.
I'm on a device that makes it a little difficult to follow the chat, so I'll leave it to you all, the facilitators of our conversation tonight, to figure out which questions to bring up and bring into the room.
Tamara's tracking them. Sure. Well, Tamara just put, maybe we can ask I had a question about the abolition of academia, but I actually had a thought that maybe would open up the conversation between the discussants as well, which is just that, Eman, you were talking about like sort of revolutionary action, mutual aid, protest, really not being so different from, you know, what happens in your book, or maybe like the act of writing your book. And I saw someone put in the chat, like asking if you both could talk about what speculative means to you. And that made me think about like why I claim to be a speculative oral historian, even though, you know, the project that Amy mentioned in my bio, like I did do that project. That's pretty straightforwardly speculative fiction that also had an oral history element. But, you know, the project I'm working on now that's coming out in May is an oral history of Dave's Lesbian Bar, which is a soon to be opened lesbian bar in Astoria. And I pretty firmly claim that that's speculative oral history, even though it's oral history of like an event that is happening. And I think the reason I do that is because creating a mutual aid lesbian bar feels very speculative to me. So I guess my question is like, I mean, yeah, why don't we could take, sorry, a person who asked that question, I didn't write your name. Oh, Jill. Maybe we could take Jill's question. What does speculative mean to you? And maybe I could push it a little more and say, like, what does speculative oral history mean to you? And I would love to also hear from Tamara and Taylor.
I'm also super excited to hear from Tamara and Taylor. So if either of you want to start, I'd be happy to cede the round. I will say for me, what makes a work speculative is an orientation towards the future, right? Is an orientation towards things to come. And I love this idea of the mutual aid lesbian bar as ultimately speculative. I think, yeah, so for me that speculation can be, or that speculative fiction could be oriented around futures that are near or far, but that, you know, fundamentally think about the forms that our society takes and how those might shift, and what futures those shifts could enable. So that's what I think about a lot.
I'm a science fiction fan, and I remember when speculative started taking off as a term, there was an effort to destigmatize and isolate science fiction, right? That science fiction was very siloed off as a genre thing that could be safely ignored by any respectable literary person. And like Margaret Atwood carefully never used the term to describe herself, stuff like that. And then people are like, oh, let's use a fancy word, speculative. You know, so there's a little bit of a like, it's another term for science fiction. But I like it. I think this is connected to what both of you said, but that it's so closely related to a verb, to speculation, to speculate, which is about an action that we're engaged in now, right? It's a link between what we are now and the future. It's us imagining, theorizing, considering that link. And that kind of theorization of the future by reflecting on how we understand the present and vice versa, right? Theorization of the present and how we imagine the future has always been a part of science fiction, but calling it speculative sort of draws out that link in a more active, etymological way.
I'll jump in with a thought on speculative oral history. I think about Kara Keeling has a book, Queer Times, Black Futures. And I think the argument there, one of the many wonderful arguments there, is about how the economy or racial capitalism as an economic system has ultimately captured our imaginations, and thinking through how much of economics and finance is a speculative, like speculating property. Speculating is at the core of capitalism, actually, and it kind of has captured many people's imaginations around the future. And the book is kind of posing different ways of thinking otherwise. And so with the speculative oral history, I think you kind of have the opportunity to kind of like practice exercising your imagination to be like limber, to be flexible, and to be able to like move through and beyond this kind of ontological capture, or capture of like how people come to know the world. And I think that's like a cool thing you're able to get to when you talk to people about the future. In our breakout room, we were talking about just how intense and wild it is to kind of sit with having an idea of what your future might be as just like, I don't know, like a practice to sit down and try to speculate otherwise. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I can add to that a little bit in that for my thesis work, I didn't necessarily engage with speculative oral history in inviting narrators to think about their futures, but instead in revisiting these small moments in oral history interviews that I had conducted that I thought really shifted the possibilities of a life's conditions or a life's future for the narrator, and inviting viewers to consider the same things for ourselves, using the idea of the brick as a sort of a tool and a site and a space of incitement, of shifting the possible, talking about the first brick at Stonewall and this this thing that may or may not have actually existed, right? But that the specter, the mythology of it, just the idea of it invites us all to think about a new beginning or a new way of being, a new way of believing in something. And so it was a fun exercise for me to sort of deconstruct, to try to find a way to deconstruct an oral history that was maybe 2 hours long to a singular moment that stayed in relationship to the rest of the life, but also to all of the systems that it was being held by at the time that it happened. And to imagine mobility within all of those systems, right? And to imagine a sort of a site, a moment, not only of rupture, but of generation. And that was giving me incredible comfort, because at the time that I was working on this project, I was really like troubled by a lot of the limitations of the oral history genre, or like oral history media, in terms of like generating empathy or creating this like, commercialized storytelling economy. And I really wanted to preserve narrators' political knowledge, because it felt so crucial to me to connect these very humanistic lived experiences that often get reproduced in podcast sound bites or in, you know, fundraiser videos because they are so human, but to really link them kind of inextricably with the knowledge that people had of what produced those conditions for them. And so it felt like that was a place that I could use as a starting point to imagine escaping from them or transforming them as well.
Thank you for going with my pivot. Taylor or Tamara, do you want to ask the question about academia?
I'm happy to, I mean, was it my question though? Or just like, okay, I mean, it doesn't matter. I'm happy to try. And maybe I can kind of backdoor some other questions from the chat that I think are interesting. So as a group, we were, when planning, we were kind of just talking about how enamored we were with the idea of being in an academic space here, and also getting a chance to read a book that is actively kind of pressing us to think through what it means to teach and to come together towards the end of the very place that we are gathering, academia being that geography. And so I'm curious about, in order to like kind of backdoor some other questions that are in the chat right now, about kind of how you've come to understand academia as a site to be abolished. Some folks are kind of curious about the authors and the people in your lives who have kind of helped you hone some of your politics. So whether that's, you know, folks in your life or scholars or novelists, what have you, kind of, yeah, the genealogy of this politic would be cool to hear about.
As the remaining academic among the authors of that, I think this question you should begin.
I knew you would say that. Yeah, so I thought a lot about this question of what happens to academia. And I remember our editor, Andy Battle, who's also an academic, and I talking about it. And I think in general, the principle in the book is that we keep what's good and we throw out what's bad, right? It's not so much that everything that capitalism has brought us has been terrible, but that often the form that it comes in is exploitative and hierarchical and awful and not even efficient, not even like good at doing the thing that it says that it does. And so in the book, we do this with many industries, right? Where it's like we keep knowledge, but we throw out academia. And so the question is, how do we produce knowledge in a way that is unconstrained by, or that is not monopolized by this specific set of institutions? And I think that that's still, it's sort of a, you know, it's a somewhat open question in the book. I think we're purposefully somewhat vague about it, but I think the idea of a scholar, a community of knowledge producers, the idea that people are really interested in science, that they're really interested in progress doesn't go away. It's just not happening through this sort of like institutional milieu. And part of it is that we don't have the same professional identities in the future that we're speculating, right? So people aren't primarily an insert profession here, right? So you wouldn't say like, I'm a professor, but you may profess, right? But like, you are all the things that make you human in this future. And for many people, that would include being very oriented around either scientific inquiry or social scientific inquiry, or cultural analysis or any of the things that we now associate with academic careers. But imagine a world in which people aren't doing that under the sort of like scarcity mentality and the winner take all system that we currently have in academia. And I say this as a potentially winner track person. I think, yeah, so I that's how I think about the sort of abolition of academia part of this question.
I'll give a slightly absurd answer. You spoke about lineages, sort of like our influences, and I still teach 3 classes, one at a time at NYU. They're all queer studies. They're all sort of related to capitalism. And all of them, I'm really oriented to like, how do we bridge knowledge that is like happening in this space, in this classroom, and thinking about knowledge that is happening or has happened elsewhere. So one is about social movements. It's about the history of queer struggle in dialogue with American capitalism and the Black freedom struggle and other things. And we really emphasize, we like read manifestos and really like, this is knowledge that emerged out of insurrection, out of militancy, out of protest. And frankly, it's knowledge that was 12 years ahead of what was happening in academia. And usually almost exactly 12 years ahead, because that's how long it takes activists and then a handful of them to get PhDs. So like the insights of insurrectionists in 1970 shows up in academic books written in 1982. Right, which is very interesting. Like, so theories about gender, about social change, about solidarity, like intersectionality, like a lot of these things emerged on the front lines of struggle. Another class that I teach is about Marxism, queer Marxism. And I've said on occasion that academia was invented in its modern form in order to try to replace Marx. That like Marx had this very powerful analysis about how capitalist society works as a whole, right? And instead to like, in the panic of like bourgeois intellectuals who were obviously running academic life, they invented, basically carved out these disciplines that had never existed before Marx, where sociology was one thing, economics was one thing, political science was one thing. These were not separate fields in 1840, right? They became separate fields as a way of fragmenting the potential revolutionary power of knowledge. And that the academia is in the aftermath of that. And then the third thing that I'll mention is thinking about oral history. That I teach a class on queer and trans work, and everyone does oral histories of queer and trans workers. And I love it, and it's a lot of fun. And something I emphasize a lot is that oral history is a research project for non-academics on some level. It's something that anyone can go out and do oral history. It was invented to be accessible. And yet it's a way of developing knowledge, developing insight, and you can share that oral history, right, as a transcript, as a write-up, do an analysis of it, post it to a website. And it's a form of like knowledge production and really taking seriously that like regular people, right, and working class queer and trans people in this case, working shitty retail jobs around New York, have fascinating things to say about their terrible jobs, right? Why they enjoy their jobs, what's awful about their jobs, and actually insights that people could write whole dissertations on, right? And probably will in 12 years, maybe, and like actually getting students to like go out and interview their friends and appreciate their friends' brilliance, to really see the brilliance all around us in the working class that is systematically excluded from academic discourse. And that's something they could continue to do without ever becoming academics at all.
We have a comment in the chat from Solby who says, I love that part in the intro where you explain why you're writing in this strange style rooted in the 2010s and 20s academic culture, which I also really, really enjoy. that told me I was going to enjoy this book. It is, according to our schedule, time to turn to Q&A. So I think I will ask an audience question. I'm stalling because I lost the question I was going to read. Okay, I found it. So Ananya asks, what was your experience of imagining / writing your own futures? What was it like to imagine being an elder? And I selfishly am going to add in, what was it like writing yourself as an interviewer?
Michelle, did you want to start or?
No, you should definitely start.
Okay.
You have a great answer to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about this a little bit in our small group, but I think that, you know, there's this way in which we think about people. We often think about people as needing to be sort of like heroes, right? Like we think of these pivotal moments in our lives, or these pivotal people in our histories, and we often write histories around individual, you know, prophets and heroes and this type of thing. And in the book, you know, we're really oriented around the idea that everyone is both a hero and not the hero. And I think that it was interesting to write this book. And to think about our own roles in this revolution. And for me, there was a bit of grief in thinking about me as someone who ends up, as I said in the group, who ends up living in liberated Palestine, but not being one of its primary liberators, right? What does it mean to be, you know, to not be the sort of like prophets and heroes of the story? You know, what grief does that entail? But what also, you know, sense of comfort, of realizing you can play this small role vis-a-vis the things that you're good at and that you're interested in, right? So us as continuing to be the little old lady versions of ourselves, continuing to interview people and ask them questions and want to write about it, which is literally what we do now. So I think there was something kind of like comforting in imagining a revolutionary future that doesn't entail either that we just kind of died out or that we didn't play any role at all, but rather that we just kind of continue to do what we do, which again is such a fundamental theory in the book, right? That everyone is kind of doing what they already do. It wouldn't take a radical transformation of our human natures or who we are, but that if we actually continue to show up as ourselves, you know, that we could still have a revolutionary future given the right conditions.
I'll give a much more idiosyncratic and irrelevant answer, which is I hate the beach. I've always hated the beach. I dislike sand and sun, especially. And I'm okay with water if it's not trying to kill you. But the most important queer space in New York is Reese, like hands down. Like with the over-policing of the pier, like the Reese is where queer life is like most vibrant in New York. And it has been every summer. And right now there's a huge, very intense struggle around, they want to tear down this former sanitarium and replace it with a playground right adjacent to the nude queer section of Reese Beach, which, you know, it's terrible. And so like Cheyenne Dora's show, a Black trans activist who I've organized with on and off, and whose interviews in the Trans Oral History Project, since we're online, she's been playing a leading role in this campaign around not putting a playground next to the gay nude beach, right? And so there's a huge struggle around it. And I've spent a lot of time at Reese because it's where all my friends go, and it's kind of awful. And I struggle, and you know, and yet it's so important to me and to a lot of people. And there's this gigantic decaying parking lot right by Reese. And every time I get in the parking lot, I'm like, oh my God, this is where I'm going to be a political prisoner. Right here. They're going to put me on this fucking beach. And I imagine that. And I don't know why I imagine that. You know, it's sort of kind of pessimism, sort of kind of like, I don't know, wounded attachment, right? Like this place is very important to me, and yet it's like really stresses me out every time I go. And so in the book, I put myself in a detention camp every speech, where I like did psychotherapy and taught people political philosophy until it was finally liberated by somebody else entirely. So that's my future.
Thank you. Those are excellent answers. And thank you, Ananya, for the question. Tamara's pulled a couple of questions that are about like the writing process of writing the histories. So Catherine asks, how did you plan / choose / create your 12 interviewees? It strikes me that you had such freedom and range of possibility, but that also seems overwhelming to me.
The device that I used was actually imagining ourselves as an editor of a future book. And like, okay, it's 2072, we want to document the revolution. Who do we want to talk to? And both Eman and I have done writing activities with people, and this is an activity that I do. And it's actually like, well, you'd want to talk to people who are involved in a variety of different ways in the struggle. And you'd want to talk to people who are involved in the struggle around issues that we particularly care about, right? Around social reproduction and how people organize systems of care and gender, right? And gender freedom, like, and Palestine and the liberation of Palestine. Like, these are things that we care about. So like, obviously, if we were doing interviews in 2072, we'd go out and talk to people that were involved in that part of the movement. And so that's one, like the framing device actually works for brainstorming the characters. And then the other is I wanted there to be a sort of richness and diversity around the characters' psychologies. Every character that I wrote in the book has a different psychopathology, which, is part of my thinking. And every character has a slightly different relationship to language and storytelling that sort of has a distinctly different logic to it. And sort of wanting to explore the facets of, that like a gem, right? You look at it, you rotate it, and there are all these different facets that make up the human mind, the human experience, a rich life, and wanting a book that can't possibly display them all, but displays these facets in some of their richness and a sense of expansiveness and a sense that there easily could be hundreds more of them, right? Because there's so many experiences in the world. I saw one question, did we write more interviews? We haven't, and we are totally ready to. A man led us in writing a new short story that didn't take an oral history form, but is magnificent and will see the light of day soon. But there are a lot of oral histories, I think, waiting to be told. We can write them, and frankly, you all could write them as well. Like, I really believe this is an activity we can all do, like writing the futures that we imagine and the futures that we're fighting for right now as an imaginative activity as part of political practice in the present.
I think I have a quick question just coming off of that. One person is also asking whether there will ever be an audiobook version, which is not my question.
We have emailed the publisher a number of times about it as an issue. It's a great idea. It is not, to do an audiobook well is not super easy, and our publisher has never done one, so we are working on it.
Especially when you have a very, very, very diverse cast of characters who have very different vernaculars, and so that's part of the issue. But we are working on it, I promise.
Thank you. That's going to be really exciting. My question was about, you said that there's a story coming, or there's a story you've written as well. It's not in an oral history form, and I was curious about, why is this an oral history form? I mean, I think it's the perfect format personally, but I'm biased because I'm obsessed with the book. But this, as a methodology, like, why is oral history a useful tool for writing a speculative fiction, and why not any other methodology, I guess?
I answered my answer to this question earlier, sort of the ways it can register personal experience, psychology, personal narrative, world historic events, big events, small events, on all these different registers, and it can sort of effectively bind them together in a way that's very hard to do in the narrative.
My answer is
Yeah.
much less fun, which is it was Michelle's idea. But I think it's also one of the many things that tie us together as co-authors, and this kind of maybe bounces off of some of the questions I saw in the chat, which are about the collaborative process and how we wrote together. But you know, Michelle and I have known each other for 10 plus years. You know, lived one block away from each other in Brooklyn and went to graduate school together. And, you know, we're besties and, you know, shared a lot of political knowledge and political standing. And but we both have a big relationship with oral history. So Emmy ran the New York Public Library's Trans Oral History Project. I do oral histories for my sociological research for my other job as an academic. So something that we both was kind of one of the things that tied us together. And actually somebody was just asking, Cassie was just asking about the process of working together on writing the book. So yeah, we each proposed a set of characters when we first proposed the book to Common Notions. So, you know, a paragraph about the character, their arc, that kind of thing. And then we commented on each other's, and then we started drafting the characters. And initially we had drafted the introduction as a way to kind of set up some of the world, but then we drafted, or Emmy had drafted it rather, and then I commented on it. And then we each drafted our own chapters, and then we would pass them back and forth. So there was a lot of editing, rewriting of each other's work, thinking together through some of the plot lines. And then we went back and re-edited the introduction and fleshed it out around the world that the characters had sort of built. So yeah, and our editor was there all along reading draft after draft of these chapters as well. Yeah, but primarily we did write, sorry, looking at the chat now, someone asked if we wrote the narrative, the chapters where we interviewed the people. Yeah, we were the primary authors for the chapters that where we were the interviewers. And actually one of the folks who reviewed the novel picked up on the fact that we had slightly different interview structures. Mine tend to start with biographical information and childhood, which is completely a mirror of my research, because in my research I trace people's like social relationships across the life course. So the very first step is to kind of set up a baseline of what happened in their childhood, and I totally do the same thing in the fictional interviews, which is funny.
Someone just asked a sort of related question in the chat. Ariel says, did language and bilingualism, or perhaps translation in transcript, become a question while writing this wide scope of narrators?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, writing characters of color, particularly bilingual, several of our characters are bilingual, maybe over half even. I think for me, it's really important to get the link if they have references to, if they have bits of their interview in different languages, it's really important to kind of get those right. And we don't always speak the languages that our narrators spoke. For like, actually for the short story that we just wrote, you know, I consulted with friends. It was like one of the characters speaks Bangla. And so it was like, there was a lot of consultation with friends. We hired people to just check our AAVE for characters that spoke that. And yeah, I wish there was actually more bilingualism in the book, and that there was a bit of back and forth with the publisher about how much explanation to give of other of instances of second languages. I'm a big fan of just just putting it in and not necessarily doing a lot of explanation around it. But yeah.
I think the book would have been greatly improved had we either had the sort of favors to cash in or the money to pay people to have a lot more help on the bilingual stuff. Like, hopefully we did our best, but you know, like, I don't know, there's a Chinese American character, like neither of us speak Mandarin, right? Like, did it come across well? Hopefully, we're not sure, you know, like, and that's I think that's a complexity in writing in general, which is people tend to speak one or two, maybe three languages. They have a particular background. And yet it would be a dreadful world if everyone only wrote stories about people exactly like them. Like, that would be terrible literature. But so how do you write about people that are different in a way that's not just exoticizing, not fetishizing, not stereotypes, doesn't just flatten people as if they were all white, you know, like, and how to do that well, how to do that respectfully, how to do that convincingly. These are compelling and powerful questions that I think writers have to confront, and our form of having so many different sorts of people with different kinds of voices made that a challenge, and hopefully we did it well.
It's also true to the form of the interview, in that people will usually adjust their speech to the common language, right? So you see a lot of Arabic in the interview with Kaukab Hassan, who's an Arabic speaker and who knows that I'm an Arabic speaker as the person who's interviewing her, right? So she says a lot of Arabic terms, and I don't ask her to translate them because, you know, in an interview I wouldn't, and that happens in my real life interviews. Whereas when I interview people who speak other languages, they usually don't use them unless I know them.
Yeah, I think you see that in the Trans Oral History Project, like looking at the transcripts of, you know, African-American trans leaders in New York. You could accurately guess whether their interviewer was Black or not by how they adjust their speech and the rhythms of that. And that's part of why it's so important, I think, to design oral history projects where they're not just like one or two or three highly trained expert interviewers, unless they're looking at a very specific homogenous community that they're all a part of. But if you want an oral history project that reflects a diversity of experiences, you need a diversity of interviewers to be able, you know, not that people can only speak to someone with their experience or their race or something like that, but like, if all your interviewers share a particular experience, that is going to torque and inflect the entire.
Thank you. I'm just like scrolling back through the chat, trying to figure out if we've missed any questions. We almost certainly have. Tamara, do you have any that you want to highlight? You're muted.
Sorry. I know that Ananya had asked, how did you decide when and where pivotal moments happened? Which I think is a interesting question in considering how multiple voices can shape a larger narrative when writing fiction. And maybe goes back to why oral history was the right medium for this story.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're trying to write a worldwide revolution, right? There needs to be both. You need to explain some of the questions, right? You need to explain some of the questions that any reader would ask, right? Like, what happens in China, I think, is like something that, you know, folks would ask, right? But I think it was also about setting up the world. So it was very important to me that that the revolution doesn't start in the US, right? That it actually starts elsewhere, in the US is one of the last places to come around, both kind of symbolically, but also theoretically, because it felt important to think about where states might fall, because one of the theories of the book is that the modern nation state falls and enables the fall of capitalism, which is sort of overheating and is an increasing crisis, and that tied with climate crisis. And you have basically increasing capitalist crisis, increasing climate crisis that the state can't keep up with. And so effectively you have more and more failed states. So thinking about where we already have failed states, right? Or where states are more vulnerable to fall, the revolution starts in the Levant for that reason, right? This is a space in which you have a lot of failed states already, Lebanon, Syria, etc. And then thinking about the rest of the world as sort of the chips falling around the rest of the world. I think it was important to sort of order it in that way. So we went back and forth on some of that. I think both the order of the chapters and the order of the events kind of played together. We did a lot of back and forth on dates. There was several rounds of dating events, and then realizing, wait, that timeline really doesn't work, and then having to go through and redo it, or thinking, oh, that timeline works in this chapter but actually doesn't fit this other chapter. So there was a lot of coordinating. There was a consistency Google Doc at some point, which I tried to maintain, failed to maintain, passed to the editor. He also failed to maintain, and then we sort of gave up. But I think it worked out.
I'll just emphasize, someone on Twitter yesterday called our book Prophecy, and I'll just emphasize that the future cannot be predicted. And this is really essential, I think, to do social movement work well, right? Like, the only hope we have is the uprisings that no one expects. And so we came up with what I hope is a vaguely plausible timeline for revolution, if the revolution is possible. But it will all unfold in its own rich complexity that we're all a part of. And that will, if we have any hope of winning, we'll have to catch them by surprise. Yes, thank you for posting my book, Eman. So my family abolition book called Family Abolition comes out in June. You can pre-order it with Family 30 for 30% off if you want. And I would greatly appreciate people's support in posting it to Amazon or whatever. Comments on social media, stuff like that's great.
Thank you. We are unfortunately at time, so I see Amy is unmuted. Thank you so much, Emmy and Eman, for your time with us. And I will pass it back to Amy now.
Thank you all so much. I feel like my head is going to fall off from nodding, listening to this conversation. It actually felt like being in a really good oral history in some ways. And I really appreciate all of you taking the time and sharing your thoughts and your work, and really great lively questions in the chat. I put a link in there too to the next and final event in the series, which actually is looking back to the experience of a free Black community in Brooklyn called Weeksville, reimagining that history through using some archival oral history. So we'll have the author in conversation with the oral historian from Weeksville who recorded those oral histories that became source material for the novel. So good night, everyone. Students from the class, if you'd like to stick around and debrief, I'm happy to do that. And thank you again so much to our speakers. This is really a lovely conversation, and only because of everything that you brought to it.
Thank you so much for having us. This was so lovely. And thank you, Taylor, Tamara, Kae. You're all amazing. And Amy, of course.
It was very exciting learning a little bit about your projects and each of you. So thank you so much for hosting this event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.